Hi guys, welcome back to another video. So today is Monday, so we are returning back to this particular sketchbook or notebook as I want to finish up the little swatches left that I want to do for this particular notebook to do for samples. So I'll talk a little bit about that if you're not familiar on why I'm doing this, but here's a quick overview of the previous session. So I've done alcohol markers, I've done pencil crayons, I've done graphite, watercolors, and water-based markers. So the last two kind of mediums that I wanted to do for the little sample swatches are gouache and acrylic markers. I kind of left these ones for last, partially because I struggle with both of these mediums. For acrylic paint markers, I am going to be using kind of like various different Arrtx paint markers, which you'll see in a little bit. For the sketch, as usual, I'm using the Pilot Color Eno for an easier time letting my sketch kind of take a step back and not smudge with any of the mediums that I'm working with. So for I think the last few weeks, probably the last few weeks, I've been doing kind of Monday's videos dedicated towards doing more of the sample drawings of specific mediums in this notebook, as I am attending a convention at the beginning of August, or I guess it's closer to the second week of August. Whatever is the 8th to the 11th counts as. But because I want to bring some of my new notebooks along with me, I find it easier to have some kind of sample drawings of mediums that are that you can use within the notebook, but I want to show people how it looks on the paper, how it potentially warps the paper, and just general use of it. So in the end, I ended up kind of just picking a few mediums that I think are quite common in a sketchbook and decided to do simple headshots of each of those mediums to show a better demonstration on how the medium behaves and performs on this particular paper, as it's not specifically like a drawing paper or sketchbook paper. It is kind of like a thinner notebook paper. It's like a very slight off-white, if anything, but it does have very smooth, thin type of paper. So I think it's more better for myself to show people what mediums look like instead of you can use it as a sketchbook and just take my word for it kind of thing. So in terms of who I'm drawing for the acrylic markers, as I guess I'm starting with the acrylic markers, even though technically it's the last swatch that I'm doing. And this becomes kind of a weird idea, as it puts me in kind of a weird position that I haven't really experienced too much on this notebook paper, but we'll talk about that once we get to the gouache session. So I am drawing Miku from the Pokemon Miku collab from a while ago, and this is the steel version. So I decided to draw her alongside with Gouache because I think they're super cute. And I think Gouache's colors are super bold and bright, mostly because of the teal and the yellow, I think look really cute together. So I wanted to do mostly those colors for today's little painting session with the acrylic markers. So if you're ever interested in acrylic markers, definitely check out Arrtx. They have a whole range of different types of acrylic markers, including these brush tip ones that I'm using. I'm also using the Simptap ones that have more of the typical shake and press down a button to kind of release more paint into your barrel and your nib. I believe they have wide ones and some bullet tip nibs. So definitely check them out if you're interested in getting some acrylic markers. They have various sets, so I think there's a good variety of colors overall. But to kind of help prime the paper a little bit here and there, I will be applying the Simptap white acrylic marker to a lot of places, because I find that some of the Arrtx markers dry out quicker on this particular paper for whatever reason. So to create kind of a barrier from the layers of paint, it's just easier for me to use a paint that's use a marker that's a little bit more juicier to cover larger surfaces. Then it'll create kind of that little acrylic barrier, and the surface will be slightly less porous, so it can have an easier time to adhere to this new surface rather than it absorbing into the paper in a very weird way. So you can kind of see that I'm doing it for Gouache's body. I'm going to do it for Miku's hair as well, because Miku's hair is kind of on the lighter side. So I'm just going to place this down to make it a little bit easier for me to apply kind of like a mintier, lighter green color, so we can shade and not make it super splotchy. So kind of back on the topic of doing the samples in one notebook. So usually if I'm doing sample photos, let's say if I have notebooks that I'm selling online, it's easier for me to compile photos of each of the mediums that I want to showcase on the paper from various sketchbooks that I've done throughout the years, because I have used several of my notebooks as like my main sketchbook, and obviously I switch between mediums quite often when doodling or sketching or just working in my sketchbook in general. But in terms of like bringing that to a convention, I don't want to give access to, I guess like for one reason, I don't want to give access to my sketchbook to random strangers and letting them potentially, you know, like manhandling my sketchbook. It could potentially get stolen or anything like that. So it's easier for me to have just one notebook there as kind of like the notebook that shows like paper quality, the texture and the feel of the cover. You can see the elastic band, the ribbon, alongside with just like the general format of the book, and see all the mediums. So I just think it's like kind of a better representation of everything, and I have to worry a little less about thievery as well. I did have I think this was during at Odafest a couple of years ago, that a person was asking for a very specific medium, and luckily I did have I guess, I don't know which sketchbook I had. It might have been the Peonies one with me, and I was able to whip it out because I was actually working in it at the time of the convention. So I was able to show the person being like, you know, this is what I think it was like alcohol markers probably, alongside with some kind of fine liner combination to show like bleed through. So they wanted to confirm whether or not there's going to be a lot of bleed through or a lot of ghosting. So yeah, it's just good to have on hand and just like easier to show people what the notebook can handle, because like I said, I'm not here to deceive you guys and be like, these are sketchbooks meant for sketching and like all your drawing needs. It is a notebook, it's just blank paper, and I just find it a little bit easier to treat it as a sketchbook for my needs. So yeah, I just know everyone else's like experience with using notebook paper or like thinner paper varies from person to person. I know usually I would prefer a thicker paper, but in the future I'm gonna look into that a little bit more. I would love to make like a watercolor journal, like a custom cover of one as well in the future that's more like square format and of a slightly larger size. So I think that would be cool to kind of, you know, talk to a few manufacturers to see what I can get done. But for now, I'm gonna still do the blank notebooks just because one, it's just fun to design the covers, and then two, I don't mind the quality of the paper, and in the future I will either opt for the dotted, the grid, or lined paper so you can actually use it as a proper notebook. And if any of you guys are interested in that, I'll definitely make those in the future. I'll just make sure to do a poll so I know what is kind of like the preferred paper. I was gonna say texture, but I'm not changing the texture. I guess like paper type. I think I want to go with the dots just because it's a little less intrusive in terms of like people's spreads, and it might be a little bit easier for people to use for like bullet journaling, I think, so that you can create your own templates and stuff, while a grid might be a little bit too in your face. So we'll see. But back to the acrylic painting little session. So I actually wanted to do the acrylic paint markers first because I was worried about warping from the water from doing gouache transferring to this particular page, and to have like minimal warping, I thought it'd be easier for me to work on this one first and then work on the gouache one on top after. Or I could have just switched the order, which would have been smarter. So right after the watercolor one, I should have done the acrylic one and then do the gouache one afterwards, or just do the gouache one like immediately, because I will run into a weird problem, or it's not really a problem, but it's definitely a little bit different compared to how I was doing some of my washes when I was working with the watercolors, which you'll see in a little bit. But we're kind of just finishing up the little Miku drawing alongside with Gouache, and for the most part, I just had a lot of fun just scribbling and playing around with the paint markers. I did end up using the Simptap markers to do majority of the line work, just because it does come to a sharper tip and it's just much easier to get thinner lines for the most part compared to the other acrylic paint markers that they have. Sometimes I feel like some of the sample drawings that I did came out a little bit derpy. The one of Miku, at least for the most part, her proportioning isn't too funky in her face. The next one I'm going to do is going to be a little bit weird, where I'm having the same problem of not tilting my sketchbook upwards so that I'm getting a weird forced perspective again. So yeah, there's going to be just a little bit of warping here and there. But I think by far my favorite piece, or part of this piece, is Gouache, because he just looks super cute. I was able to kind of finagle my way with getting a decent shadow color for kind of like the yellow. I used purple, and then for the white of his body, it was easier for me to do like a mixture of purple, a little bit of gray, a yellow, a cream color, and a green, like all mixed together, just to kind of set the white to not be super flat with a one shading color, if that makes sense. So I wanted to make sure there was a little bit more form and color to make everything look a little bit more voluminous and a little less flat, but also just to make him look a little bit more colorful compared to the rest, because if they're kind of like one monochromatic color, it's just fun to add other colors either in highlights or in shadow, just to make it a little bit more visually appealing. But I'm kind of glad that for the most part I am going to be done with the samples. I think the gouache one, other than like the pen swatch sample that I want to do at the very end of this, just for a quick overview, I don't own every pen and I have to look for the pens that I don't have in this particular room. So I might go dig around to see what other pens I have to do an extra kind of swatch in my sketchbook. But the reason why I'm going to be glad that I can finish these sketches in this little swatch portion of the sketchbook is that I kind of want to just move on back into my actual notebook sketchbook that's supposed to be the one I'm supposed to be working in. Like, what I wanted to do was daily, but I think I am going to really push myself in probably August, right after AnimeFon. I will push myself to actually build up an actual daily habit of sketching, because I'm actually gonna like block out time for myself to do that instead of like thinking, oh, I'm gonna do it at the end of every night or whatever. So I just feel like it becomes like super inconsistent, so I might change it to the morning, because I think it might be easier to start my day with sketching rather than ending my nights with sketching, because sometimes I end my nights at like 4 a.m. and I just want to sleep rather than being like, oh, let's sketch something for 10 minutes and then go to sleep. It just feels a little bit not productive. It feels like I'm forced to do it. While sketching in the morning, it feels like I'm just starting my day, so it doesn't feel like a waste of time, if that makes sense. So moving on to our last medium, technically, is gouache. So yeah, I did end up doing gouache last, and I think all of you guys know that I have like a love-hate relationship with gouache. When it works out, I really love the look of it, and you know, I feel really proud when it works out, but it feels really demoralizing sometimes when you kind of put all this effort and time into painting with gouache and then ending up hating the end result. And I don't know, I feel like because it has the potential of being able to continuously cover and build up, I should be able to reach a end result that I like, in comparison to something like, let's say you're drawing with ballpoint pen. There's not really like a covering up method unless you like put a new piece of paper down or white out, what have you. Or like pencil, you can always erase. Watercolor, it's a little bit more difficult unless you're like going to really heavily lift off paint off your paper. But for the most part, gouache you can kind of continuously cover up if you're careful about it. So I don't know, I feel like I just don't give myself enough time. I do kind of have a theory that I do want to test out, because I have been noticing something more recently, and I kind of noticed it when I was doing the tight sketch. So for watercolor and for gouache, if I am sketching my rough sketch, which is like usually done with the Pilot Color Eno and the color red, I am worried that the Pilot Color Eno is going to dissolve on my paper due to the water from the painting mediums, such as like watercolor and gouache. But I don't typically erase all my lines anyways with the red. So I end up usually just putting a cleaner sketch of whatever character I'm drawing with kind of like graphite. So in this case, I'm using my mechanical pencil. It's in the, I think, 2B or HB lead, and that way my sketch doesn't really disappear. So after I do that, I do a wash of watercolor. This also helps color up some of those pinkish red lines, and this is kind of helping prime the paper a little bit for the gouache. So the thing that I've been kind of noticing is that because the way how I record these traditional videos, I do not let myself become super close to my paper or my sketchbook. So I feel like I'm not giving myself enough time to do all the finessing and detailing that I want to do, or the patience to actually fix things, because I'm so far away from my own sketchbook. So I'm gonna see if I can find a better angle in the future if I end up doing gouache again, and letting myself have that more breathing room between me and the camera and the sketchbook, because I do feel like it's a little bit too in the way in terms of like wanting to get really into something, just because the camera will be literally right in my face. So hopefully I can find a better angle. If not, I'll find another way to like zoom in such a way that won't disrupt the footage, but I can work a little bit more properly. So I am still adding our little base with watercolors. Now, if you watched, I think it was last week's video where I painted Ina from Hololive with watercolors, the texture or like the drawing process of the watercolors on the paper seems a little bit different. Now, I was very confused when working on this and thinking like, why is it just vastly different? It kind of has this weird like speckly kind of texture. So you can see on this one of Ina, she has no texture that is like very apparent or anything like that. And I'm using obviously the exact same paper. I'm using the exact same method alongside with the same paints. The only thing I changed is my brush, which I don't think was the cause of it. But you can see that after I let it dry completely, it kind of remained somewhat normal. So my kind of suspicion is that me doing the acrylic paint marker drawing on the kind of like backside of this gouache painting, or not the backside, it's like the next page, I think it created a very weird border. So the thing that I was trying to avoid was warping of the next page, but in doing that, I ended up making a very weird drawing process for my paper. So the water ended up seeping kind of through my paper a little bit because I was adding heavier washes, which I didn't really do too much with Ina. There were some areas that had a little bit. I'll show it probably near the end that there was like a slight speckling here and there. But because I was pooling the water on the paper and it was seeping through a little bit, and me applying the acrylic paint all over the next page, the water that was seeping through was not able to seep through to the next page. So I think it was sitting on top of my acrylic paint markers because it's no longer like a more porous surface. And because of that, it kind of left these weird splotchy marks instead of actually letting the paper seep through and dry. So while I was letting... Oh, I didn't explain who I was drawing. So I got a few comments asking if I could draw Yunli from Honkai Star Rail. So apologies, it doesn't really look like her. I'll do a better job in the future when I draw her digitally or like sketch her out in a sketchbook spread or something, because I do like her design and I think she's super cute. So I would like to learn more about her character and, you know, try to draw her more as well. In terms of summoning, I'm not too sure if I'm going to summon for her. I think I'm going to wait and see who else is up next to decide fully, because I do think she's really cute though. But the bleed through. So while I was letting the kind of wet washes dry, I ended up putting another sheet of paper underneath and letting that dry with it to prevent the kind of weird splotches from having a difficult time just drying in general. Because I did notice on the acrylic paint marker little page there was a little bit of moisture, and it's definitely because the watercolor was seeping through and then sitting on top of it. So I definitely think that is the reason on the weird texture though, because Ina's, for the most part from what I remember, did not have that issue. I'm just glad when it dried it didn't really cause that problem, otherwise I would have been like more confused. But luckily I'm also covering it up with gouache, so either way it didn't really matter in the end, so it's not too big of a problem. It was just kind of like weird to see because I usually paint no problem with watercolors on this paper without having that weird splotchy patterning, if anything. So still having a kind of harder time doing the gouache painting. So like I said, I like doing a watercolor base first to kind of plan out colors a little bit, but mostly to kind of prime the paper just a smidge more, just because I find it easier for me to paint gouache on a textured surface rather than on something that's much more smoother, because it just has something to grip on and adhere to rather than slipping and sliding on top of a smooth surface. But in the end, I don't really follow too closely with some of the colors. So Yeonli's hair is on the darker side, so I ended up painting her hair quite dark with the gouache, even though my initial washes were actually quite light. I wanted to add flames into the front and the back, but unfortunately every time I work with gouache, and I do think that because I'm not giving myself enough time to actually just focus and work on the actual piece for like a longer period of time, I was just getting tired of painting with gouache and getting frustrated, so I ended up not doing the flames, because initially I was gonna make a more either like a darker background or allow myself to paint around like stark white and go really bright in the middle and kind of fade out into, I guess, like white, yellow, orange, red to kind of get the intensity. But instead I kind of just left it as the watercolor washes, and I mostly just render out her face, her hair, and just like the upper portion of her outfit rather than whatever I already painted in terms of where I placed the watercolors. I also ended up switching my brushes 3 times, so I was having a little bit of an issue painting her eyes, so I switched to a kind of like more longer, thinner brush, and that one was just not really working with what I wanted it to do, so I switched again to a brush that had a sharper tip, which is the one that you're seeing me use right now, and had a little bit of an easier time painting in a little bit of the color shifts in her eyes alongside with doing the line work as well, just because the tip just allows me to get the thinner lines that I want rather than like big splotchy thicker lines. And for the most part, every time I add line work, it just gives me a little bit more hope in terms of liking the piece a little bit more, as long as I don't botch up the line work. There is a little bit of a mishap that I overpainted her hair on the right side, so it made her jaw look very weird. I tried correcting it, but the paint wasn't quite opaque in terms of my consistency, so there's kind of like a little shadow or ghosting because the layer was not quite too opaque, so I didn't cover up the darker color. I'll probably try my best to paint another character with gouache. Actually, now that I think about it, at my current sketchbook, I actually have only 3 spreads left, so I might just spend the next few nights sketching in it, and next Monday, hopefully if time permits, I will be doing the final page in that sketchbook, which, if I'm following the same trend that I tend to do, which is matching the front and the back, I did the front with gouache, so that means I'll do the back with gouache, and I'll try to keep the theme. So hopefully that'll be Monday's video, and then maybe the following Wednesday I will also have a sketchbook tour of the sketchbook, which I don't know, I feel like I'm embarrassed to show just because I personally don't like a lot of the drawings in this book, but that's okay. So Yeonli is finished. I'm trying to show you the little splotchiness on this side. So these are the areas that had the most kind of like bleed through from the water. Also, here are some of the pen swatches that I ended up doing on the next page over. I am going to see if I can scrounger up some more pens in my house because I know I have a bunch of other ones that I just didn't grab, but I wanted to do kind of a swatch like this, so if people wanted to see what the little swatch bleed through looks like on the back, you can kind of see that the little Sharpies bleed the most here. I think one of the dry erase markers bled a lot too, but everything else has a little bit of ghosting or just like not visible for the most part. So yeah, still very thin paper, but very usable in my opinion. So we have our pen swatches, we have our acrylic markers with Miku and Jirachi. After that, we have Yunli with Gouache, which I end up not finishing the rest of her. We have Ina in watercolors. I have Mint in water-based markers. Then we have my OC Kaisen in pencil or graphite. Then we have Ritsu for ensemble stars and colored pencils. And last but not least, or I guess the start of it, we have Kaya with alcohol markers. So hopefully you guys enjoyed watching me and coming along with me while I did a bunch of samples and swatches in this particular sketchbook. So hopefully moving forward, we'll be finishing up this sketchbook and I'll be showing you guys the little final spread and we can do a quick sketchbook tour and finally move on. So thank you guys again for watching today's video and I'll talk to you guys next time in the next video. Bye!